Well, please have a seat. And again, it's great to see you all. If we haven't met before, my name's Matthew. I'm one of the pastors here at Sunridge Road Mission. And you should find somewhere around you a little yellow card. If you haven't got one, there are a few, I think, spares at the back on a table, or obviously there's some on seats where people aren't sitting. And just in this series, we're looking at Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And each week we're printing the passage. So you've got a copy of what we're going to be looking at. And then on the back, there are a few questions. And there should be some pens in the seats. So feel free to kind of, circle things, underline, write notes. We're doing this because it's important as we look at Jesus' words. We don't just hear them, but we do something about them. We put them into practice. Now, this week on Monday night, I was in a grump. And there wasn't any specific reason for that, I don't think. I think I was probably tired, a bit disappointed, but I was in a grump. And actually, as I sort of sat and stewed in that, the focus of that more and more became a frustration with Alice, my wife. Now, there was no real reason for that. Actually, Alice hadn't done anything. I think really it's because it was easier to be cross with Alice than to deal with my own heart in that moment. Now, I think part of me did know that that wasn't healthy, that wasn't right. But actually, I chose on Monday night to sort of marinate in my own grumpiness. And the irony is, the more I thought about her neglect of me, the more I neglected her. And it didn't just stay passive. I started to speak words that weren't kind and were harsh. And the gap between Alice and I started to grow bigger and bigger. And I felt stuck. As I looked inside my heart, I knew the situation was wrong, I knew it needed to change, but I looked inside my heart, all I could feel was frustration. And I guess we know something of that experience. I don't think it's just me that gets into that place where we get stuck relationally. And it might not just be a few hours or days. It might be weeks or months, maybe even years or decades. And we know that we've done some things wrong. We want the situation to change. And yet when we look into our hearts, all we can seem to find is frustration and anger and disappointment. Well, what do we do? This morning, as we come to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to speak into this. And you remember what Jesus says, really, as he teaches? He says, try my yoke on, try my ways out, learn my ways, and put them into practice, and you'll find that they're good. So we're going to look at Matthew chapter 5, verses, and I'm going to read from verses 21 to 26. This is what Jesus says. He says, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raca, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fires of hell. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you've paid the last penny. Well, we were seeing last week that Jesus has come to fulfill the law, not to abolish it. So last week we looked at this verse. I think there's a slide of Matthew 5:17, where Jesus says, do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So when Jesus came and Jesus taught, he wasn't doing away with what had gone before, he was fulfilling it. And really in this section now, we get 6 examples of that. So you'll see if you kind of flick through this section, you keep seeing this phrase. Jesus says, you've heard that it was said. So you've heard that it was said, you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. Anyone who divorces his wife, do not break your oath. Eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And then after each one of those, there's then a little section of explanation. And that always starts with, but I tell you. So do you see the pattern? Jesus is taking some aspects of the law and how people understood them, and then he is interpreting them for us. He's fulfilling them. He's showing us what that means and looks like. And what Jesus is challenging here isn't the law itself. So Jesus isn't saying, God told you this, but I'm telling you something different. What Jesus is challenging is a kind of wrong interpretation of the law, a popular misunderstanding that actually misses what the law was all about. So one of the groups in his mind was the Pharisees, and the Pharisees loved the law. They were constantly working out what God says, what you could do, what you couldn't do, because they wanted to keep every single bit of it. But that meant that their approach to the law was they were constantly working out where the boundaries were. So they wanted to kind of minimize the law so that they could tick it off and say it's done. But in doing that, sometimes they missed what the law was all about, and actually they didn't enjoy the blessing of really living in God's ways. Now, there's a pattern, I think it's up on the screen. As I've been reading and thinking about the Sermon on the Mount, someone pointed this out to me, and I found it really helpful. In these little, you've heard it said, but I tell to you, they've said there's a kind of threefold pattern. First, Jesus gives the conventional understanding, how the law was understood in his day. Then Jesus kind of goes under the surface and diagnoses a kind of vicious cycle or a heart problem. And then at the end, Jesus gives us a transforming initiative, something we can do to actually help us in that. So let's work this through with our passage today. So we start with the conventional understanding. You shall not murder. It was understood plain and simple. Murder is wrong, if we have the next slide. Don't murder other people. And in some ways, that's quite straightforward, isn't it? And it kind of bounds the law. And so, actually, if you haven't murdered anyone, or if you're not in the middle of plotting to do so, actually, this law doesn't have much to say to you. Now, you can see the appeal of that. That means, for many people, we can tick that off and say, well, that law's not about me. And Jesus is saying, actually, in treating the law like that, we've missed the real heart of the law. And then he identifies this vicious cycle, this kind of heart problem. So let me read again what he says. He says, I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raca, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fires of hell. We might not all be murderers, but that doesn't mean all our relationships are sweetness and light, does it? And Jesus actually says, he identifies here anger and insult. And when he's talking about anger, he's talking about an unrighteous anger. There is a righteous anger, isn't there? It's right to be angry at injustice and at sin and at evil, but Jesus isn't talking about that. He's talking about an unrighteous anger when we're against someone. And this passage is really focused on when our heart is wrong towards others. Bruce is going to be preaching in a couple of weeks. Later on, Jesus addresses, what about when people do wrong to us? How do we respond? But this is focusing on when our heart is wrong. And Jesus really picks out anger and insult. Those words, Raca. Raca means empty-headed. It's like saying, you stupid idiot. Fool is the word behind that is the word more. It's where we get moron from. It's like saying you're a scoundrel. So Jesus is saying, actually, anger and insult are significant. Because that's the heart behind murder. That's the same heart issue. Later in the New Testament, in 1 John 3:15, we read these words. It says, anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer. See the connection? That heart of hatred, of anger, and of insult actually is the heart of murder. And it would be crazy, wouldn't it, if God says, look, murder, that's a big problem in my eyes. But the heart that's behind it, anger and insult and rage and hatred, that doesn't really bother me. That's fine. It's just murder that bothers me. See, you see that heart is an issue, isn't it? It's the heart that says, I wish you were dead to someone. It's the heart that sees someone and says, I want you out my way. And the reason it's a vicious cycle is that anger and insult feed one another. The longer we allow anger to sit in our hearts, the more and more likely that's going to come out in insult, isn't it? A cross word, a harsh word, a word that we regret. And equally, the more and more we insult, whether to someone's face or just as we're speaking about them or even just under our own breath, the more our heart of anger grows. You see that cycle? And that cycle can go round and round, can't it? And the more words that have been said, the harder it is for that anger to die back down. And the more and more that cycle goes round, the more stuck we become in some of our relationships. And actually, that cycle, when it's going on, is bad for everyone, isn't it? It's bad for the other person who's being wronged, who's receiving our anger and our insult. But actually, it's bad for us too. It's bad for us for our hearts to sit in a place of rage and bitterness. Everybody loses when this is going on. So what can we do about it? That's the natural question, isn't it? What can we do about that? And then this is where we get, Jesus doesn't just leave us there. Now he gives us a transforming initiative. How can we actually get ourselves out of that situation? And in that sense, it's important we hear when Jesus teaches and when Jesus gives us his law, his ways, it's important we hear them the right way, because the law does different things depending on where we're at. So imagine as a parent, you come into a room and two of the kids are having an argument. And you see actually one of your kids is being really harsh and unkind to their brother. Well, what do you say in that kind of situation? You call them out, don't you? And you say, actually, it's not okay to use that kind of language. There's something wrong in your heart, in the way that you're thinking of and caring for your sibling. You use the law, you see, to convict and challenge. But then imagine the situation when that same child comes to you a bit later on in the day, and they say, Dad, I just don't know what to do. I just get so cross sometimes. And I say stuff I shouldn't do. Well, that's a different situation, isn't it? And you see, then, as a father, you say, son, let's talk that through. Actually, what could you do in that moment? Do you see how the law feels different, doesn't it, depending on where we're at? And there are times when we need God's law to challenge us. But there's also times where we're coming to God as our Father and we're saying, God, I don't know what to do. Father, I don't know what to do. And he's saying, look, this is my way. Walk this way. So Jesus' words here are actually how to break free from this pattern. And the basic message is this: it's reconciliation instead of rage. Reconciliation instead of rage. Or to put it another way, choose to settle your conflicts rather than letting your anger settle. Choose to settle your conflicts rather than letting your anger settle. And he gives a couple of examples, and I'm just going to try and put them into slightly more contemporary language. So he says, imagine that you're on the way to church. And actually yesterday something's happened. You were serving in a ministry with a team, and it all went a bit wrong. And you got cross with someone else on that team, and you said some words in the heat of the moment that weren't very kind, and you sort of regret. And actually after the event, everyone just headed off, so it hasn't really been dealt with. And you come into church that morning, and halfway through the service, you kind of remember that person that you'd spoken to, and you look around, and you notice that they're not there that morning. And Jesus says, leave the service. Even if Matthew's preaching, just get up and walk out, get your phone out and give them a call. If you need to apologize, apologize. And heal that relationship. Or he gives another example. He says, here it's not within the church, it's out in the world. So imagine you're at your workplace. And imagine that one of your colleagues has a grievance against you. You haven't been doing your work well enough for the last couple of weeks. You haven't been doing your part of things. You've been distracted. And actually, the last couple of times they've emailed you about it, you've just ignored it because you don't know what to say. And they now have gone to the boss and have complained against you, and the boss is calling you both into the office to deal with it. And Jesus says, even as you're walking to the office, make right with that person. Acknowledge your wrongs. Own up to your side of things. Reconcile. Now, in those kind of examples, what strikes you? The thing that struck me is this is really urgent. Jesus is saying, don't wait. If there's an issue with someone, if someone's got a reason to have something against you, deal with it straight away. And it's urgent because God cares about this. It matters to him. But it's also urgent because this is really serious. Jesus here talks about people being in danger of the fires of hell. And I don't think primarily that's just a kind of threat. It's also a real warning that anger and rage is serious. And if we let it get a hold of our hearts, that's where it ultimately leads. So think, for example, about cancer. We know that cancer is serious, don't we? We know it's serious because once there's some of it in our body, it can spread and cause all kinds of problems. And we know it's serious because it can be fatal. So if you're with your GP and they even mention the word cancer, our ears prick up, don't we? We don't sort of walk away and come back to it a few months later. We want to know what's going on. We want action. We want them to go and deal with that and get that out of our body as quickly as possible because we know it's serious. And I think there's a similar sense with anger and with rage. If we let that sit in our hearts, it's dangerous. it spreads. And ultimately it can be fatal, because it gets into a place where we won't come back. And just like cancer, actually anger's the same. The longer we leave it there, the harder it is to deal with, the harder it is to remove. Or let me give you another illustration. Okay, some of you will know that we got some hens back in September. It's been a bit of a mixed story. So just before Christmas, one evening, we neglected to shut the little latch, on the hen house. And a fox got in and killed all the hens. You can send me a card this week, okay? A fox got in and killed all the hens. And we didn't really think foxes could get in. So we hadn't really seen a fox in there or anything like that, no signs of a fox. So we were kind of thinking these hens are fine. But there was a bit of rotten fence, and it came through there, and as foxes do, it took one and killed the rest. Now suddenly we realise how serious that danger is. So we're having another go. We've got some more hens. But even just yesterday, I was working on repairing the fence. I'm putting some wire behind it so that it's fox-proof. And actually, I'm taking that pretty seriously. I'm not leaving bits, and bodging the job, because I've seen how serious the threat is. And I think there's a similar thing here with God's law. How do we see God's law? That fence around the chickens, there's one narrative that says that is restricting their freedom. Those poor hens, they can't go out and explore the woods. But that's not the story, is it? And we can see God's law like that, can't we? God is just restricting my freedom. So all this stuff he's telling me I can't do. But actually we realize God's law is good. It's to protect us. God realizes how serious things like anger and hate are. How when they get a hold of our hearts, the damage that they can do. And you see, when we see that God's law is to protect us, suddenly we want it, don't we? We want to follow it wholeheartedly and quickly. So think about what, again, the New Testament says later on in Ephesians chapter 4. It says this, it says, "In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." You see what this is saying? The danger of our anger sitting there is, before long, it leads to sin. And so again, the counsel is the same, isn't it? Deal with that quickly. Don't let the sun go down and be in that place. And you notice that last bit, do not give the devil a foothold. That's the equivalent of a crack in the fence where the fox can get in. Actually, if in our relationships we allow anger to stay there and sit there, the devil's got an easy route in to us. Or let me use another illustration. So if any of you have been out mountain biking, it's great fun when you're out on the trails. But particularly this time of year, when you get back from a ride, your bike is covered in mud. So there's a picture. Okay, your bike is just spattered with mud. It's covered. And what do you do about that? Actually, what you should do is after each ride, you should wash it down, hose it down, so that the mud doesn't build up, so that it's clean and ready to go next time. Now, it can be tempting not to do that. But you'll know if you've done that, the longer you leave your bike like that, the more times you go out and don't clean it, the harder it gets to clean. The harder it gets to get the mud off, and eventually the mud will clog up all the workings and other problems will come. So what are your options? Option one is you never go out in the mud. You save your bike, you put it in the garage, and then on a beautiful day in the summer, you go down the pavements or around the track at Lister Park and you put it away for another year. And that does solve the problem, doesn't it? But that's not really what mountain bikes are all about. And in our relationships, we will get muddy. There will be tensions. There will be hostilities. We will hurt each other. All of us are sinful, aren't we? We will do wrong. And one option is, like never going out in the mud, is just say, look, I'm not going to deal with people because people are complicated, and I'll just pull back. But surely that's not the right answer. That's not life as it's meant to be, is it? So then really we've got two options. One option is we let that mud build up, and in relationships we just let that hostility and anger sit there and grow. But actually, the more it builds up, the harder it is to deal with. And Jesus is saying what is healthy is actually as soon as we notice the mud, as soon as we notice there's an issue, we clean it, we deal with it. And actually, if we keep doing that every time, then things stay healthy and good. And this applies to so much of life, doesn't it? It applies to marriages. It applies to parenting. It applies with our colleagues in the workplace. It applies with our mates at school. It applies in the church as we're serving alongside one another on different teams. And what Jesus is saying here is that a huge characteristic of spiritual maturity is that we're quick to initiate reconciliation, that we do that quickly and easily. You know, I think of a few illustrations that came to mind. I think of one time recently where a member on the staff team, they came to me and they said, Matthew, I need to apologise because actually something I said was done out of frustration. It wasn't the right heart. Now, I hadn't even noticed. It wasn't a big grievance. But actually, isn't that the culture that we should live in? That if there's even a sense that it might have been an offence, if we knew our heart wasn't right, we're quick to sort that out, to heal it. Or I think of another service we had here. It was a communion service. And there'd been a bit of an argument about COVID and masks and all that kind of stuff. And before we took communion, someone crossed over from one side of the church to the other to heal that, to apologise, to make it right. And again, isn't that what we want as a church? Isn't that healthy that actually at communion time there's some people who get up and sit down and say, I need to put this right before we take communion. And certainly I know in my own heart and my own life I have to do this. You know, you can ask Alice and my kids, you can ask the staff team, the elders, the growth group. You know, we get things wrong. And we have to come and we have to say, I'm sorry. You know, I was wrong against you there. Will you forgive me? And actually, in that culture, everybody wins. The person that you've wronged wins because actually you deal with that. But actually, isn't that so much better for us too? When our hearts are free of that anger and that rage. So what stops us? I think one of the big things that stops us is our pride. It's hard, isn't it, to acknowledge that we're wrong. It doesn't get any easier. So the picture coming up here, some of you will recognise it. This is Scott Hall Farm, which is in the middle of the carriageway on the M62. So if you're driving over the Pennines towards Manchester, you'll come across this section of the carriageway where the carriageway kind of splits in two and then reconverges as it goes around this farm. Now, the kind of legend of this situation, that the farmer there is was a guy called Ken Wilde. And the kind of story that's told is that, he stood up against the authorities when they wanted to build a motorway through his farm. And he wouldn't give them an inch, and he held his ground, and so they had to build around him. That's not actually what happened. He released a documentary some years after to say actually there's sort of geological faults under the farm, so it was too complicated for them to build through it. But we like the other story, don't we? We like the other story, so it's stuck. And there's something in us that likes that kind of proud stubbornness. That way of never giving up in a conflict, never backing down, never yielding. But actually, God says here, where that's in our relationships, where that means we never accept our wrongs, where that means we don't initiate reconciliation, he's not impressed. He's not impressed at all. That's not a sign of maturity, but of immaturity. Actually, what Jesus is calling us to is to be soft in our hearts, to be quick to reconcile. And I think, obviously, this applies both to men and to women, but I've noticed that it's easy for us as men to get stuck, to kind of settle in our anger and get stuck there, and to focus solely on how we've been wronged and stop taking responsibility for our side and our faults. But actually, the longer we sit in our anger, the more and more of an obstacle it becomes. And it doesn't just affect those that we relate to, it also affects our relationship with God. We'll see that in the next chapter. When Jesus teaches us how to pray, he says, actually, our refusal to forgive others will undermine and affect God's forgiveness of us. And we see that later in the New Testament in 1 Peter 3. If we could have that passage up. It's talking about husbands and wives. It says, husbands, in the same way be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner, and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Again, do you see the connection? How, if our relationships are broken, it will affect our relationship with God. Actually, the longer I'd let that situation go on with Alice, the more it would begin to affect my relationship with the Lord. So all of us face a choice. All of us are going to get muddy. That's relationships, isn't it? The choice we face is, what do we do? in that situation. And the choice is, if we could have the next slide, either we let our anger settle and we let rage be the place that we sit, or we settle our conflict and we initiate reconciliation. You know, in my folly, actually, I didn't sort things out with Alice that night. I went to bed angry. And that had an impact. It meant actually for the next couple of days, there was tension between us. But then I did what I needed to do, and I apologized. And she was gracious in forgiveness. But think of God's example to us in this. Now, it's not a parallel, is it? Because God has done no wrong to us. And when God is angry, his anger is always righteous. He's angry about the right stuff and the right amount. So it's not a parallel. God has not wronged us. We have wronged God enormously, haven't we? You know, all the good things he's given us, so often we're not grateful. We know his ways, we know what pleases him, and yet we ignore them. We have wronged God. And God would have every right to stay distant from us and to judge us for what we've done. But we have a God who initiates reconciliation. We have a God, even though there's nothing on his side, who makes reconciliation possible. We have a God who comes from the glory of heaven and becomes a man and seeks us out so that we might be reconciled with him. We have a God, he hasn't got anything on his side to deal with, but he deals with the stuff on our side. Isn't that incredible? We so often can't even apologize for the stuff on our side. We can't take the hit for that. But we have a God, even though there's nothing on his side, who takes on himself our sin. You know, some of us might feel convicted hearing these words. It might be that some of us have committed murder in our past. And we're thinking, do these words condemn me? Well, we have a God who has made reconciliation possible. Because he said, all that you've done, I will deal with. God is so, he's such a God of peace and a God of love that he does that for us, which is remarkable, isn't it? Or we see this again with Jesus. You know, again, Jesus never wronged anyone. But still we see his instinct and his love of reconciliation. Think about what happened with Peter. You know, just before Jesus died, when he needed the help of his friends the most, Peter sold out on him, didn't he? 3 times he denied that he even knew Jesus, after all that Jesus has done for him. And then after Jesus was raised again from the dead, what happened? You know, Jesus had done no wrong to Peter. He had nothing to sort out on his side. But that didn't stop him initiating reconciliation, did it? Jesus sought Peter out. He stood on the beach with a barbecue, waiting for him. And when they were together, he didn't wait for Peter to bring up the subject. Jesus initiated. We have a God who loves reconciliation, who is quick to humble himself to make good. You know, surely we can choose reconciliation when a lot of that wrong is on our side. So I want us to think, you know, where in our lives, where in our relationships do we need to initiate reconciliation? Maybe there's someone you can't look in the eye at the moment. Maybe there's someone you can't talk about without anger bubble up in your heart or without words of insult coming out of your mouth. Maybe there's people and you know that they've been wronged by you in some way and you've never really sorted that out properly. And the encouragement, Jesus' encouragement here is do that today. Do that today. Choose reconciliation over rage. And sometimes, I don't know, it might be you're sitting here and the whole way through you're thinking, I hope they're hearing this passage. I hope that's going in. They need to come over and speak to me. My encouragement would be sort out your side. You know, so often in conflict there's 2 sides, aren't there? Sort out your side. You have to leave that to them, don't you? And to their heart before the Lord. But sort out your side where you've done wrong. And how do we do that? Well, we've got to approach someone, haven't we? We've got to acknowledge what we've done, not hide away from it. We've got to apologize and ask for their forgiveness. But do it today. It doesn't get any easier. You know, the more we sit in our anger, the more we let the mud build up, the harder it is. And we're going to have it, like we've done each week, we're going to have a time of response now. where we can fill in the back of these cards. So there's 4 questions. What did you notice? What questions does it raise? How can I put these words into practice this week? And then a chance to speak to God in response to Jesus' words to you. And we can fill in any of those, but what I'd really encourage you to do, in the box where it says, how can I put these words into practice this week, is write down some names. You know, if there are places where actually we need to initiate reconciliation, there's a problem, and some of that's on our side, then put some names down in that box. You know, identify where the Lord is convicting us there. So we'll have a few minutes, and then I'll come back up here to lead us.